Howdy, neighbor, and welcome to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Thank you for joining us on this episode. Today, we're going to be talking about veterans and the criminal justice system and how that plays into our friends and our neighbors that live close by. Today, we're going to be interviewing two neighbors that have gone through different paths down the reintegration into their society. Today we're going to be talking about two separate stories of military veterans that had two different pathways once they left the military. We're going to talk about Claire, who was honorably discharged from the military, and we're going to be talking about Joe, who was other than honorably discharged from the military. In Claire's case, we're going to be looking at the definition of what honorable discharge means. And now we will be looking at the definition of what other than honorable discharge means when you exit the military. We're going to be looking at two different stories of discharges from the military. On one hand, we have Claire, who was honorably discharged, and she has had much success with her availability to access to health care and resources that exist for veterans. On the other hand, we're going to be talking about Joe, who was other than honorably discharged and quickly found himself in the criminal justice system.
My name's Joe Smith. I was formerly a private first class in the United States Army.
So what was your role in the military?
I was a communications specialist and I worked with 10th Special Forces Group. I deployed to Afghanistan with them and I ended my career with a different unit at Fort Bragg.
So what was your experience like within the military?
I love the military. My father served in Vietnam, so it was a family expectation that I would go in and I was excited about that. I did really well in my training for my job. I learned everything I could about radio communications, satellite communications, the things that help a unit stay alive when they're separated from one another or just noise is going wild when you're in a firefight. I did really well in my deployment. One reason 10th Group wanted me was that I knew my job so well and they knew that I would never let the radios fail when they needed them. I didn't get to end my career with them though, and that's kind of when things started getting hard for me. The Army moved me to a different base. I didn't have any of my friends or any of the guys that I deployed with. Didn't really like my new unit and I knew I was getting out anyway and things kind of started to spiral then.
What do you mean by spiral?
I started self-medicating with alcohol and drugs and partying with folks I didn't really even know or care about and definitely impacted my work. I didn't show up to work the same way, started getting in trouble with both work and law enforcement. So it just kind of turned into a snowball from there. One thing led to another and I just kept getting in more and more trouble and finally I was dishonorably discharged.
What was that experience like for you, going through that?
For me, it was really hard because I knew that I had loved the Army when things were going well and I knew that that was a big part of my family was military service. So I thought I could just go home and put the pieces back together, get a job and be around my family, but I found people like my father who had been in the military, they had a lower opinion of me and didn't really want to interact with me. Trying to put things back together using VA services didn't work either because I just wasn't eligible with the dishonorable discharge. I tried to get help for my substance use issues. That wasn't available. I tried maybe going to college, but the GI Bill wasn't available and things that might be able to help me get back in the workforce, those were gone too because of the discharge.
So what happened when you got home?
So, I kind of talked about how I still had the substance use thing going on and, I just had the same pattern of bad behavior, trying to find anything to help me with the disconnect I was feeling, and I just ended up getting in trouble with civilian law enforcement back home around Houston. And I mean, it wasn't long. I mean, I was on probation almost immediately, and then I violated, and then found out I was going to have to be incarcerated for a time.
Did your experience of incarceration contribute to limitations of resources that you had available?
Yeah, it just made everything worse from the dishonorable discharge. I mean, people might be able to be willing to give you the benefit of the doubt when you're fresh out of the military service, maybe with the dishonorable discharge, but once they figure out that you've been incarcerated after that and in trouble with civilian law enforcement, it's pretty much like all the doors are closed.
So how did you cope with that?
I just kept turning back to drugs and alcohol, trying to find folks who could relate to me, but I mean, really that just led to some unhealthy relationships too, because a lot of these other folks were struggling and didn't really have an answer or places to go or things to do.
So where are you at now?
Right now, I mean, I'm trying again to put everything back together, trying to figure out ways that maybe don't need the VA to help with my substance issue. I'm trying to make a connection with my family again, but that's hard. Really, I don't even know where I'm going to go or what I'm going to do.
Let's now reflect on Joe's story. One thing we can take away from his testimony is that he's very proud of following in his father's footsteps and joining the military. From day one, he put all his energy into his position. Unfortunately, in his ranking, he experienced a lot of combat and, in result, a lot of trauma from that combat. Like so many other vets in his position, he experienced trouble with the military and trouble with the criminal justice system after he left as a civilian. When you run into trouble with the military, you receive an other than honorable discharge, and you lose almost all services provided by Veterans Association. This is problematic because certain veterans that have seen combat or have been in very traumatic situations do not receive the help that they need.
Yeah, so my name is Claire Mayworm. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm 28 years old, and I joined the Army right out of college.
Can you talk about your experience in the military?
To be quite honest, I had a great experience. I had to travel the world and see a lot of stuff that I wouldn't have been able to afford on my own. I worked in logistics, so basically trying to figure out how to get someone from A to B or some things to A to B. And I never actually deployed, which was really great.
Can you talk about how did you get discharged?
So actually I have an honorable discharge, which is awesome. I left the Army as a captain. So I would say that I'm pretty fortunate, and if I could do it again, I would. And I was able to, once I got home, I was able to go to Stanford for my MBA, and I used the GI Bill for all those expenses, which, as you can imagine, was a great, thank God. My time afterwards, I never experienced really any PTSD. Emotionally, my family's been extremely supportive. I still have like my network of friends. I came home to my 2 dogs. And now I have my MBA, and I feel like life kind of is starting again now that I'm back.
Thank you. Well, that's great. So you went in the military, and after you discharged, like, how do you feel between like being in civilian and in the military?
Like feeling like I'm back into society.
Yeah. How do you feel?
Good. I mean, I feel like I kind of was just on like this long sabbatical. It sounds kind of bad, but I enjoyed my time, and I really took my work serious, as I do all the time. But really, my integration back into civilian life, I feel like has been pretty smooth sailing, and it's been, like I said, I have like this great support system, and I'm able to really push forward and look at the positives, and yeah.
Do you have any plan in the future? Anything you want to do?
Yeah, well, so currently I work at Goldman Sachs under their military hiring program. I know, I feel like my life's just getting better. But I'm helping with new mortgage tools. So not really where I saw myself, but it's, if you know anything about Goldman Sachs, it's a great opportunity and really is gonna, lucrative. And at 28, I couldn't have asked for a better opportunity.
As we look back at Claire's testimony, we notice that her experience seemed to be far different than Joe's experience in the military, because she left as a high-ranking captain and her benefits were easily accessible by the Veterans Association. All of Claire's services were provided as she exited the military. She even had a GI Bill that helped pay for her education. And she got a job at Goldman Sachs, which is a very prestigious investment firm.
Hey everyone, the group and I came together and we agreed that it was probably a good idea for me to weigh in as a member of this community and maybe talk about some of the inside factors that might be driving it and maybe a path forward that could create some realistic solutions for veterans facing involvement with the criminal justice system. I can speak from experience and say that this problem is real, and it does involve some real PPO dynamics related to social and economic hierarchies within the military culture. The case studies that you'll see in this video here, they're actually somewhat anonymized stories from folks that I met in the military. One thing that it does bear noting is that the happier story here with Claire, the person I knew in that circumstance actually had engaged in some pretty problematic behavior on their own part, just related to discipline with government funds in a very large amount. And they still had pretty much the scenario that you heard Claire talking about for their post-separation lifestyle and opportunities. So I guess that kind of aggravates even a little bit the sort of overall dynamic of how groups see their opportunities play out. That being said, it's not like it's hopeless. I mean, the military is a big bureaucracy to change and move, but there are some things that the military and veteran community can do to disrupt these patterns of veterans, especially more disadvantaged or less well-off veterans, having a greater likelihood of making it into the criminal justice system based on some of the risk factors we've talked about. I can speak from experience on this, that the military actually, it already has a standardized set of programs to prepare you for your transition to civilian life. And that's generally your last year in the military. You go to a series of seminars, classes, and trainings related to kind of vocational rehab, the different benefits that may or may not be available to you, and that general sort of subject matter. I will add the caveat, though, that a lot of those classes actually aren't really accessible to folks who are leaving under the other than honorable circumstances that we talked about. So if you are being what's called chaptered out of the military under a provision of the Military Code of Justice, based on a substance use pattern or criminal behavior in the service, those training opportunities and educational opportunities are actually closed to you. So one of the things that we came up with first, right off the bat, is all of these resources should be available to a transitioning or recently separated veteran, regardless of their discharge status, because really it's a punitive measure, and it just moves to amplify the downstream life effects that these individuals face after a run-in with the law or a pattern of substance use or things like that in the service that ends up seeing them separated. So going back to those programs that exist, they end up being a little cursory, and it's probably an opportunity where you could get really intentional about identifying those risk factors during that year of seminars and courses and consultations with medical and behavioral health staff, and creating a sort of case management model like you would see as patients leave the hospital. You identify what their risk factors are in leaving the environment and pass those off to somebody who's ready to receive the client, the individual, however you want to describe them, back in the community. In this case, that would be probably with the VA or local government veteran services organizations. The reason we identified this, it fits into the military's model of top-down social planning policy solutions to issues that they face. And there's also the functional benefit of just knowing that the military is consistently one of the most, if not the most, well-funded portions of our government. Services can always be made available just about, and that's also generally true of the VA. When you see things like our recent shutdown, they really were not affected in the same way that other agencies were. So from a resource standpoint, this seemed realistic. From a public support standpoint, it's really hard to find large constituencies of people who oppose veterans' opportunities, especially related to their reintegration into society. And it really seems like a social justice win too. So you could probably build a pretty broad coalition around the issue. That's about all I have. One thing I add to folks who maybe don't interact with veterans in whatever my circumstance, I say, pay attention to the news about the wars, and if you can, talk to a veteran for a moment. A lot of people are losing touch with them, and I hope that folks in the program can make those bridges. Thanks for your time. Hope you enjoyed the presentation.
I'd like to thank you for joining us on this episode, where we talked about the social justice issues of veterans and the criminal justice system. I'm leaving you here today with a little song. It's such a great feeling to know you're alive. It's such a great feeling to say goodbye. It's such a great feeling. I love you all. This is Mr. Rogers saying goodbye.